Hi guys, it's Yaya from Night Riot Cosplays. Today I have part 2 of Blossoming Starlight Klee's entire outfit. Today I'm just showing you guys how I am finishing up the skirt and adding all of the final details onto the entire costume. Again, I'm sorry that this is over a half-hour long video, but there's just so much information that I'm trying to show you guys that it just ended up working out like this. So I hope you guys stay till the end to see how I made the entire costume. And let's get on to crafting. For the next layer of Klee's outfit, we start by making a petticoat. So I actually tried to make a proper petticoat by watching these two videos. I tried twice, it didn't work out, and I gave up trying to make a petticoat the proper way. But I definitely recommend you watch those videos if you are looking to make a proper petticoat for this. I, however, decided to do an improvised version of it. So I start by cutting out long strips of tulle. I wanted each strip to end up being about 8 inches long. So I cut out 2 layers of tulle that are 16 inches long and about 3 inches wide. And then I double it over, so if I'm counting from the bottom, there are 4 layers of tulle. And then I loop it over an elastic band that's the same size as my waist. And then I pull the ends of the tulle through the loop that I had created. This is like an old technique that I had learned back when I was in high school for making these nice fluffy tutus. Essentially what we're making is a tutu, but you'll see how we cover that up in a second. But this is the first layer of the imitation petticoat. I don't have proper footage of this, I think because I was still a little bit frustrated with my first 2 attempts that I just forgot to pull out my camera. You're going to make 2 circle skirts out of tulle. So you want to double over your fabric however you can, and then cut out 2 circle skirts that is just shorter than the length of the actual skirt that you want to make. And with your circumference, I used this circle skirt calculator to measure it, and I used the shortest setting for the length on this one. Then with those measurements, I just cut out my circle skirt from my tulle, and then it should be about the same length as your elastic waistband. If anything, you might have to pleat the circle skirts of tulle a little bit to make sure it fits, but you want to sew down those 2 circle skirts to your elastic waistband, making sure that you're using a zigzag stitch to do this so that the elastic waistband still has stretch to it and the seams won't pop when you try to put it on. By putting 2 layers of circle skirt tulle on top of the looped over tulle that we had done for the petticoat, it smooths everything out so that under the skirt, the top layer, the actual skirt, you don't see those looped over pieces of tulle as much. The next thing that we need to prepare before we can get started on the skirt is we need to make that gold edging that Klee has on the bottom edge of her skirt. Some people would cover EVA foam to do this, but I decided to go with piping. Here's an excellent video that explains what piping is and how to make it and how to use it. But essentially, piping is just a rope sandwiched in between some bias tape and then sewn to the bottom edges or just the edges of a lot of garments to give it a little pop. So here I'm taking this gold Yaya Spandex fabric and I'm cutting out bias tape. Bias tape is just strips of fabric cut on the 45-degree angle of the fabric because this angle has the most stretch to it. And then when all my strips have been cut out, I sew the ends together to get one continuous length of bias tape. And then I just go through and I wrap my cording. I think I used 1/2 inch thick like paracord rope as my cording. You can really use anything as cording, and I just had that lying around, so that's what I ended up using. So I sandwiched the rope in between my bias binding and I just fold it over and I sew down the entire length of the rope. that makes all the prep work for the skirt done. So now we can actually move on to making the pattern for the skirt and then the actual skirt. If you look closely at Klee's skirt, you'll notice that there's actually 8 seam lines. I'm pretty sure this was meant so that it'll kind of make it look like a flower petal almost. Either way, this is actually really simple to achieve. All we need is 1/8 of a circle skirt pattern. So once again, I will refer you back to this calculator. You go in, you put your measurements to this calculator, and you get your final size, and you want to draft your quarter circle skirt. So you put a quarter circle skirt into the calculator, and then I think I went with the midi length for mine. I'm not actually quite sure. You either want to choose the shortest or the midi, and then you're gonna get your sizes, and then you're gonna basically make your pattern. And then after that, you just want to fold the pattern in half and cut it along that line to get your 1/8 of a circle skirt pattern. There's this wonderful tutorial that I found. It is a blog tutorial though, if you want to see how all of this math works and how to properly do it, but essentially that's all you do. And then with that 1/8 of a circle skirt pattern, you obviously want to go and cut out 8 pieces of this, making sure that you are still trying to take the corners of the fabric. Like usually when you cut out a circle skirt, you put the smallest circle in a corner like a fold, and then you cut the rest out. You want to keep the same idea because you need this fabric to be cut on the right warp, or the right bias I suppose, in order to give it the flowiness that we need. So make sure you're keeping it in the corners. And then as I go through and I sew up all my seams, I also make sure that I am pressing open all of my seams. And then I'm using a stretch knit fabric that doesn't fray, so I don't have to worry about hiding any frayable edges, but I do want the top stitching on the edges so that it looks like it's actually finished. So I just go through and I pin down my seam allowances and I sew about 1/8 of an inch from the original seam to make sure that I'm getting those nice top stitch looking seams on the side. And then once you have all 8 seams done, you should have one complete skirt. It should be about the fullness of a full circle skirt, just with all the extra seams. And then the top edge, it's actually going to get covered by that little band of fabric that Klee has at the top. So I just roll hemmed the top edge of the fabric, and since it's non-fraying fabric, I just folded it under about 3/4 of an inch and I stitched it down. And then for the bottom edge, we can actually attach our piping, making sure that we're putting wrong sides together and then sewing all the way down. And then you have to press the piping away from the edge of the fabric so that'll sit nice, and then do one more seam along the edge to make sure that it stays down. Again, this video has a really great explanation on how to do this. I definitely recommend watching it. And then there's just one last detail for Klee's circle skirt. The little clover, almost heart things that she has on the front and the back. So I drew out 4 little hearts together in that little shape, and I picked the best one, I cut it out, and I traced it onto some gold Cricut vinyl that I got off Amazon. And then I tried to put this through my Cricut machine, but for some reason my Cricut machine was not working this day. So I just ended up tracing it onto the back of it, onto the back of the vinyl, and cutting it out by hand, and then ironing it down onto the front and the back of the fabric. I tried my best to make sure that it was right in the center, but I really eyeballed it. If you want to measure it out, that's fine too. Just do it however you want. Then with the base of the circle skirt complete, I move on to making that kind of strip of fabric, almost that high-waisted piece that Klee has on her skirt. So I start by measuring how high I want it on my body. I believe mine ended up being about 5-6 inches tall. That's with seam allowance, by the way. And then you take your fabric and you cut out a strip as tall as you want it, and then the length of your strip has to be about as wide as your waist measurement. I actually I cut it to the exact measurement of my waist measurement, and then when I hemmed the sides, it ended up being a little smaller, but that's okay because it gave it a little bit of stretch around the back, which also helped to hide the top edge of the skirt when I wore it later. You need to cut out 2 rectangles of fabric that are the height that you want and the width is your waist measurement, and then you're going to pin them right sides together, so all the way around except for one of the short ends. I leave it open so that I can turn the entire tube inside out, and then I just press the edges down, and I do run a top stitch seam all the way around again, and the edge that we had left open I turn under by hand and I stitch it down by hand as well. That makes the base of layer 2 done, and now it's time to move on to the details slash what I will call layer 3 of the entire outfit. So this starts by making a ruffle. We need a ruffle to go around the tulle circle skirts that we had made earlier on. So I wanted mine to be about an inch wide, inch and a half wide. It needs to peek out from underneath the skirt, so you definitely want to make it wider than your ruffles, like from your neck piece. So I go for about an inch wide. That's 2 inches because we are going to fold it over, and then another inch for seam allowance. So in total, I cut rectangles about 3 inches tall, and then I measured how big my circle skirts were all the way around the circumference of that, and I took it times 2 so that we can gather it all and make a ruffle. By this point I was running out of fabric. I had actually sourced this fabric from another country while I was on vacation, so there was no way of me getting more fabric if I needed it. So we were using every last bit of this fabric. So I'm just piecing together a bunch of pieces of fabric, hoping that I have enough to make the long strip that I need to make this ruffle. In the end, I did have enough. However, it was all cut on the wrong grain lines. So it's a really wonky ruffle. If you look at it in the end video, at the end of the video, you'll see it's kind of a weird ruffle. But that's just because I had to do it very oddly to make sure that I had enough fabric to make it. Once you have all of your fabric cut out, you will just sew the ends together to make one long strip if you're having to splice fabric together like I did. And then once again, take it to your iron, fold it over, press it down, run your ruffle stitches, pull the fabric together so that it actually ruffles, and then you're going to sew it to the 2 circle skirt layers of your petticoat, or what I'm going to call a petticoat. Once you have the ruffle sewn to the petticoat, we can move on to make Klee's apron thing on the front. So I start by cutting out 2 pieces of fabric that are 10 inches wide by 9 inches long. This is because we're going to add a little ruffle at the top of the fabric, just a teeny tiny one. I noticed that when I didn't add a ruffle to the top of this, it had laid a little too flat with the petticoat. So we're going to add a little ruffle to the top so that it'll move with the petticoat and look a lot nicer. Then once that rectangle was cut out, I cut out another strip of fabric that was 2 inches tall by 20 inches long. It's double the original rectangle because this is going to be the longer ruffle, like the tighter ruffle that Klee has on the bottom of this apron. You want to start by taking the longer strip of fabric, the 20-inch one. You're going to take it to your iron, press it down again, and then fold it over and press it again, and then run your 2 ruffle stitches on the top edge. For this one, I ended up using white thread for both stitches just because I did not want to have to go through the trouble of unpicking it. So if you don't mind not being able to completely see where your stitches or your strings are to pull them, just use a matching fabric. Then we're going to do a similar thing as we did on the black collar for that Klee has. We're going to gather our ruffle down to 10 inches to match the bottom edge of the original rectangle, and then you're going to sandwich the ruffles between 2 pieces of fabric. Then you're going to sew all the way around, making sure you're leaving an opening at the top to turn it inside out. And then with that done, you're going to grade down your seams and clip your edges, and then turn this apron inside out, making sure to push out your corners nicely. And then I decided not to top stitch all the way around. I just think it gave it a better look. And then the top edge, I run a straight stitch along it, and I just gathered down just a little bit. I'm not going intense ruffles. If anything, the size only went down by an inch max. So we're going from a 10-inch rectangle at the top to 9 inches with a ruffle at the top. Then I make sure to press the ruffles, again remembering that we're not going to put our iron down and then move it around. We are putting our iron down, picking it up, moving it over, putting it down to get those nice square ruffles that Klee has at the bottom. Then I also sew on 2 snaps to the corners of the top edge of the apron. We will be sewing the opposite side of the snap to the skirt later. Now I'm moving on to the flower details of the apron that kind of connect the original apron to the ruffle. I start by freehanding a pattern to it on some paper, and then I fold it in half and I cut it out to make sure that I have a symmetrical kind of petal shape. And then I take this to my fabric and I trace it out. Hold on, let me do the math. There were 4 petals for, I think I did 4 flowers. So 20 times. You trace it out 20 times onto some white fabric. I went with my pattern fabric here just because I once again thought it was cute. And then once that's done, you're going to, oh, hold on. That's incorrect. I checked. You actually need 32 pieces. So you cut these petals out 32 times from your choice of white fabric, and then you'll pair 2 of them together, making sure right sides are together, and sew all the way around them, leaving the bottom edge open so that you can turn it inside out. Then once 2 layers are sewn together, I clip the top pointy edge so that it'll look nicer when we turn it inside out, and I turn them inside out and then I press them under my iron so that I get a nice flat petal shape. Then I go in and I take one petal, I fold it in half, and I put my needle through it so that there's a tiny little fold or pleat at the bottom of each of the petals. And then I just like loop it around the end of the petal to make sure that'll stay. And I do that for 4 petals. I'll string 4 petals together, making sure I'm doubling back, making a loop around the end of each one so that it stays shut like that. And then once I have 4 of them together, I tie off my thread. Then I'll try my best to flatten out the centermost part of the petals, and I'll poke my thread through the underside to the front so that I kind of have a working thread. And then I will sew on these little jewels that I found at Joann's. It's not in Klee's Canon design, but I thought it was such a nice detail. You don't have to do this step, I just like how it looked. So I take these buttons that are almost like diamonds and I just sew them down to the petals. Then once all the petals are sewn together, I will lay it onto my little apron part and I pin it down, making sure that I'm arranging the petals so that they kind of mix into each other. Just pin them down so that they're all arranged nicely, however you like them, and then I go through and I hand stitch down every petal. Then I just go in and I sew the opposite end of the snaps onto the skirt part, and then I'm able to attach the apron, and that makes the apron done. Then I moved on to the black buckle pieces of that band, that high-waisted piece that Klee has. So I start by taking my black fabric and I take some white chalk and I start sketching out about how long and the shape of the top of the buckles. I'm making sure here that I am using a lot of chalk because when I'm done, I take another piece of fabric, I lay it on top of the original and I press down. And when you take it off, if you used enough chalk, the shape should be more or less like stamped onto the second layer of fabric. And then I just repeat that 2 more times so that I have 4 pieces of like these buckles. Once I have all of the pieces stamped, you'll notice that I'm not cutting really close to them. That's because for these, I decided I was just going to layer the fabric. So there's 2 layers of fabric. So in total we have 8 pieces of fabric to make these buckles. I just layer the piece with the pattern on the top. I pin it down and I take it to my sewing machine and I sew along the lines that I had drawn. Here, full warning. At this point, I had an accident with my sewing machine, so there's a slight gore warning going ahead. You'll see why if you choose to watch it. Then once it's sewn, I can go in and I start grading down all of my seams, making the seam allowances smaller and clipping the edge corners to make sure that there's not a lot of bulk in the seams. Then I layer 2 of my buckle pieces on top of each other, pin them together, and then I take an awl and I poke a hole into them. I know I had marked 3 here, but in the end I only ended up needing 1 hole in 2 pieces of them to add the bar kind of part of the buckles later on. Once you have the buckle parts done, we can set them aside. We will be sewing them on later. So now you can just set them aside and we can move on to making her gloves. That makes all of the big pieces of Klee's costume done, so now we can move on to the smaller details. That means I'm starting with the glove here. So first out, I trace my hand on some scrap paper, make your hand turkey. And then I am measuring the bottom of my, the hand part where my wrist is. I trace that out onto some paper and then I measure it. And I divide it by 3 so that the base of this kind of petal shape that she has at the top of her glove, it'll fit nicely all the way around the glove. So once I know how big the bottoms of each section needs to be, I start by drawing out one of the sections, trying my best to make it look nice and petal-like. And then I find the center, I fold it in half and I cut it out so I have one symmetrical piece. Then I grab some black stretch fabric. I know this one has glittery parts on it, but I'm using the wrong side of this fabric. The other side is unpadded, it doesn't have any sparkles or anything on it. So as long as I sew it right sides together, the only thing that you'll see on the outside is the solid colored stretch fabric. So I take my hand turkey and I layer some fabric over, so I have 2 layers of fabric. I roughly cut out a rectangle around my hand turkey, and then I take some tailor's chalk and I trace out the figure of my hand, and I thoroughly pin the fabric together on the inside of the hand tracing, and then I sew along the chalk lines with a zigzag stitch. This is just easier to do for me. It allows me to be a lot more accurate with my lines. And then once I have everything sewed, I can go in and trim down all of the excess fabric. Then I take the petal patterns and I cut out 8 pieces. In the reference photo, she has 4 petal shapes, and we need 2 layers to make ours, so it's 8 pieces of fabric. With everything cut out, I start pinning together the flower petal pieces. going for making sure that my wrong sides are together, so that when I flip it inside out, all of my seams are on the pretty side and I just have a plain black side on the stuff that's going to be seen. Then I also grabbed some interfacing. This is sew-in interfacing, so it doesn't have the sticky sides, so you can iron it onto the wrong side of the fabric. I definitely recommend using fusible interfacing here instead of sew-in. I just didn't have a fusible interfacing that was stiff enough, so I went with sew-in instead. All I do here is I make sure that I'm adding my seam allowances around the end, and I sew all 4 pieces together, and then I just sandwich. Once I have the outer edge of the petals sewn together, I just stuff the interfacing into the center of the two, and then I can finish sewing it up. Then I can take my glove and pin the cuff part to it and then sew all the way around. I wasn't too worried about finishing this seam here just because it gets hidden anyway and it's stretch fabric, so it won't fray, but you can definitely finish it if you want to. But I just pinned it to the cuff, making sure that when I'm sewing it, I'm stretching it out a little bit to make sure that the cuff will be evenly sewn on all the way around. And then that makes Klee's gloves done. And then we get to the absolute worst part of Klee's costume, is all of the bows that she has. For this, I'm going to show you basically how to make one bow, and then from there all you really have to do is make different sizes for each of the different bows that Klee has on her costume. For Klee's bows, I used a couple different fabrics. First, the fabric that you see me using here and in the example is not the fabric that I ended up putting on the costume. This is a old crushed velvet that I had lying around. Most of the bows are made out of a true, like a nice red 100% cotton fabric. And then the biggest bows, like the bows on her hat and on her bag, I made with a red pleather. And in order to get the stripes on those, I used a kind of burgundy colored PolyCotton to make the stripes on them. I'll show you how I made those later. The basic idea for how to make these bows is that you want to double the width and the height of what you want your end size bow to be, and then you just sew them both ways and you'll have a really nice plush bow, like a really nice fluffy bow. That's the size that you want it to be. So for example, if you want a bow, the end size to be 3 inches long by 2 inches wide, you need to cut out a rectangle that is 4 inches tall by 6 inches wide. That's basically doubling both the measurements and then making sure you're adding a seam allowance around the entire rectangle. And then I fold the bow, the fabric, I fold it in half the long way, the horizontal way, and I run a line of stitching along that. And then you want to turn your bow inside out so that the seam is hidden on the inside. And you want to make sure that while you're doing this, you are centering the seam on the back of the bow. So instead of having it on the top of the piece of fabric, you want to move it so that it will go down to the middle. And then you just want to fold it in half the vertical way and sew along that seam, and then flip it around so that the seam is on the inside, and then you can hand stitch. I take a thicker embroidery thread and I sew a little line of gathers, like some running stitches through the center of the bow, and then I pull it tight, and that's how you can get that bow shape. And then from there you can take some scrap fabrics and fold it in half or however you want to make the kind of center part of the bow that will cover the string from before. And then if you want to make the tails, like a lot of Klee's bows have, I just freehanded some tails onto a piece of paper and I cut them out. I traced it with chalk onto some of my fabric. I made sure I had 2 layers, and then I just sewed along the chalk lines, turned it inside out, very similar to how we made the buckles beforehand. And then after that, I just make sure to press everything down flat, and we have bows. To make the big bows out of the red pleather, I use the same principle. I double the size that I want the bows to be on both sides, except now, before I start sewing them in halves, I take some red PolyCotton and I cut out some bias binding, and then it's really a tedious job. But with the bias binding, I pin it to the red pleather and then I sew down each side of the binding down, making sure that I am trying to keep my seams as straight as I can so that I have a nice clean top stitched edge. For the ultra small bows that Klee has on like the back of her gloves and in her hair, I take some of my knit fabric from before that didn't fray, and I tried to cut out as straight as a line as I could on them, and then I take some hem tape and I just iron the pieces together. Here you can kind of see how it works. I know it's a bit blurry, but I just take the hem tape and I pull one end of the fabric over to the center and I hit it with my iron so that the tape will activate, and then I do the same for the other side. And then I cut out a little bit thinner piece of fabric to gather around the center so that it'll hide any of the hem tape that didn't get completely melted. Finally, with all the 3D printed pieces done and painted and most of the bows done, I was able to start connecting everything. So all I did to connect them is I take some embroidery thread and I tie a knot in the bottom, and then I will run it through the bottom of my bows behind where the little strip of fabric to hide all the stitching from before is, and then I will turn the 3D printed part that it corresponds to upside down so that I'm looking at the back part, and I will glue the thread down to the 3D printed part with some super glue. And then once that's done, I take a little bit of scrap cotton fabric. I cut a piece of scrap fabric that's small enough to be hidden in the back of the piece, and then I lay it down on top of the thread parts and I absolutely cover it in glue in all the corners to make sure that it stays down connected. I do this for all of my bows, and it actually held pretty well throughout a whole con day and then travel as well. It is pretty sturdy as long as you're making sure that you are absolutely dousing your fabric scraps in super glue. If you want to watch how I made the 3D printed parts, how I prepped them and painted them all, you're going to want to watch the next video that's coming out on the bag and all of the 3D printed pieces. But if you want to find the 3D print files for all of this, there's a link down below to my Patreon. It's also in my bio. My Patreon has all of these free resources for anyone that wants to use them, and my 3D print files for this entire Klee costume are available for purchase on my Cults 3D page as well, if you guys are interested. I modeled almost all of the pieces for Klee's bag myself. The only thing that I did not model myself was her vision. I actually got that for free on Thingiverse. To connect the 3D printed pieces to the front of bows, however, it's a little bit different. If the 3D printed piece is flat enough that it can just get glued onto the bow, then I will just super glue it onto the bow. Otherwise, for pieces like the big bows, like the ones on the bag or on the hat, I take some embroidery thread and I super glue it to the back of the 3D printed piece, and then I take a scrap of fabric and I cover the thread on it as well with super glue, like we did before. Except now I make sure that on both ends of the embroidery thread I'm leaving them open, so it's not doubled over or anything. It's just one layer of embroidery thread as it comes, and then I thread one end through my needle and I poke it through the front of the bow to the back, trying to make sure that I'm hiding that kind of poked hole behind the 3D printed piece. I do this for both sides, and then I'm able to pull the thread taut from the back and position the 3D printed piece as I want it, and tie the embroidery thread in the back nice with some knots, and then cover the knots with super glue to make sure that they don't come undone. Finally, we've made it to the home stretch of this entire costume. So here what you see me doing is I'm sewing down my pleats. This entire time I thought that if I had not sewn down my pleats they would just sit nicely. I was wrong. They did not, by this point in the costume, they did not look nice like when I had first pressed them down. So make sure that before, when we made our shirt, you sew down your pleats. Otherwise you're going to be here like me. I'm taking some white thread and I am running a ladder stitch through the side of the pleats to make sure that they sit and lay nicely, and don't become undone as the shirt gets worn and put on and taken off. With that out of the way, I can move on, and I take two of the bows that I had sized for Klee's costume and I sew them onto the arms of her costume. Then I take a large snap and I sew it onto the front of the costume where I want that bow to sit. I sew the opposite end onto the bow that goes around her neck, and then I can just snap the bow on and off when I'm getting dressed or taking the costume off, and I won't have to worry about it getting in the way. Then I situate the little black collar piece that Klee has onto my dress form again, and I sew on the bow that goes on the back of her neck onto the little collar part. Then I pull on the petticoat over top of the shirt, and I take the skirt that we had made earlier and I also put that on top of the petticoat. Then I snap on the apron, and then I take some hook and bars. I sew the bar to the skirt, and then I sew the hook part to the high-waisted part of Klee's costume, making sure that it's facing upwards. Like, hook and bars have like that little rounded part. I make sure that the rounded part is facing up so that when I grab the hook on the skirt, it'll all be held up together by the high-waisted part and I won't have to worry about it coming off. Then I take the high-waisted part of Klee's costume and I hook it on to the skirt with the hooks and bars that we had just sewn in, and I close it in the back. I'm not sure if I mentioned this before, but if I didn't, I'll mention it now. The back is just closed with Velcro. I take some Sew On Velcro, I sewed it to the sides, and then that's how it closes in the back. Then I take the black buckle pieces, the 3D printed parts I painted and I had stuck them on there before. It works just like a normal buckle, except for the little bar part. It doesn't actually move. So all I did was I poked the bar through one of the holes that we had poked a lot earlier, and then I glued it down on the wrong side, and then I just slide the buckle on, making sure that the bar is sitting on top of it in that kind of crevice that I had modeled into it. And then I just take the slider part, I slide it onto one side of the buckles, and then I slide the other piece, the other side of the buckles, right behind it, and I have some convincing looking buckles on the front. But with those built, I pin them to my dress form, and then I just hand sewed the edges down first, making sure that the sides were evenly spaced apart and sewn down nicely. And then I also sew them, I run a tiny little whip stitch in the middle part where, like right between the the part that holds down the fabric and then the actual buckle, I just put a little stitch in there to make sure that it stays nicely, making sure that you are not grabbing the shirt underneath, you are just sewing through the high-waisted layer. Then I can move on to the skirt. I measure on each side of the apron about where I want those flower and bow pieces to go. So I kind of eyeballed the one side that I wanted, and then I measured it, and then I tried to copy it the same way on the other side. Here you can see that they're actually pretty even. And then I take some hot glue and I make sure that it is really hot. Like, I have left my iron on for a while to make sure that the glue became really, really hot. And then I put some glue on the back of the 3D printed piece first. I made sure to put a lot of glue on it, and then I stuck it to my skirt. But when I was doing this, I made sure that I was pressing on the back of the skirt, like underneath. I was pressing it into the hot glue to make sure that the fibers of the skirt fabric got really nicely coated in glue so that it would stay. With that, our costume for Blossoming Starlight Klee is done. Whew. Finally, Klee's entire costume is done. I hope you guys enjoyed the tutorial. I've basically shown you guys how to make the majority of the costume now, so hopefully you guys can go out and make your own Blossoming Starlight costumes. Next week I'm going to be showing you guys how I made the bag, and finally showing you guys how I prepped all the 3D printed parts. Again, if you want to find all of the 3D print models for you guys to just print at home by yourselves, they are linked down below at my Patreon. I really appreciate you guys sticking this out with me and watching the entire process. I hope you guys were able to learn something new and that your costumes come out amazing. Again, thank you guys for sticking it out with me. I really appreciate it. And I'll see you for the next project.